Right, yeah. Well, thank you to everyone who's been in this morning. That's Tony Barter from Unicode Games, Andrew Ronsley with his dual hats on RISC OS development or RISC OS developments and RComp, and lots of stuff going on there. I shall try something now, and we'll see how dangerous this is of sharing the screen. There we are. That's what we would have had at the show theatre to tell you what. So we've done the 10:30, 11:30. Hopefully we've all had some sort of lunch at 1:30. And we're going to go to RISC OS Open next, which I believe is not Steve Revill. I think it's Rob Sproulson. So we'll pass over to him if he's available.
Hello.
Definitely Steve.
I'll just stop my screen sharing.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. I hope everyone's not falling asleep after their lunch. I'll try and keep you awake, stay upbeat. So welcome, I'm Steve Revill from RISC OS Open, and I also have lurking in the chat Rob Sproulson of LSR, long-time helper. So hopefully he will be able to help answer some of the questions that come up in the chat. We've got quite a lot to talk about today, so without further ado, I will switch to the shared content. And can we see this? Thumbs up. Are we good? Excellent. Thank you. So it's been a fun and challenging year for all round, but thankfully the end appears to be in sight. Things are starting slowly in the UK, at least, to return to normal. And there's been no let-up in progress in the RISC OS world. So we would like to talk you through some of the things that have been happening there. So the things I'm going to cover today are what's changed since last time we talked publicly, some of the things that are being released and have been released that you may or may not be aware of, some announcements about our bounty scheme, and some thoughts about RISC OS into the future, and then I can open the floor for a bit of Q&A. So looking at what has happened recently, just before Christmas, we launched a custom build of RISC OS specifically for the Pi 400, which was a bit of a surprise release, I believe. So it was an all-in-one Raspberry Pi built into a keyboard, like people from the past, from the Acorn Electron days and beyond. I'm sure we all remember these. We did a custom build with a bit of custom graphics just to give it a bit of polish. And this was released freely to the community alongside the new hardware release from Raspberry Pi. And all of those downloads are available on our website. And it can actually run on all Raspberry Pis, but it felt like a moment of celebration, especially at the end of quite a difficult year. Another thing that we have released recently is an update to our development tools. And people who are interested in artificial intelligence will find some of the technical changes quite useful and interesting. There's been the usual bundle of improvements and bug fixes into the development tools, and people who already have the development tools get this pre-issued. So get in touch with us with your license key if you haven't received information about this, and we will sort it out. Also, the basic manual, which I am holding artfully here, this was out of print because it was so popular we sold out of it some time ago. And we've taken the quiet period in between to make some significant errata fixes. So we fixed a few corrections that were fed in from the community. We've added a few more bits and pieces to it. And now we've up-issued to issue 3, and this is back in print. So if you want to buy it, you can buy it from our store on Amazon. And for the first time ever, we are releasing it freely as a digital download on the Rule website. So if you go to the downloads part of our website, go to other downloads, scroll down that page, and you'll see some of the books that we've released for free in digital formats. And this is now one of them. So that is the complete basic manual. It's quite a hefty tome. It covers everything. an essential starter for learning to develop in RISC OS, and you can get it for free now. Also, bounties. We've had quite a lot of progress on this front. I'll talk more about the bounty scheme as a whole, but one of the things I did want to talk about today and show you is that one of the ambitions was to support the PNG image format, or PNG. I don't know how people prefer to pronounce it. I prefer PNG. So this is now in Change FSI for exporting pings, and it's also in Paint for exporting pings. We've had support for importing pings into Change FSI for quite a few years now, but this is a new feature. And I am going to attempt to switch to sharing a quick screen grab. Here we go. So hopefully, if you can see this, yep, excellent. I will launch into this and explain what you're seeing. But this is how the new feature looks in use. And forgive me if it runs a little bit slowly, but it's always a bit laggy showing video over Zoom. So as you can see, we've got ping output as a new option in Change FSI. And you've got all the options there for compression and monochrome versus color. And what we're going to do here is we're going to demonstrate taking a sprite image and converting it to a ping in Change FSI. And just to show how universal this image format is nowadays, one of the things we can do is save that image and then load it in the sorts of applications that would be used to seeing these universal image formats. So I'll save it over here, and then we can load it into, as an example, NetSurf, the popular open source web browser for RISC OS. And we can see just by looking in the title bar, it is indeed, no surprises here, a ping image. But you will find these things, especially for computer graphics, all over the web, and it's great that we can create them ourselves, especially when sending images to people who may not have a RISC OS computer. So the next thing is we're going to load the sprite into Paint, and now we're going to attempt to exercise artistic talent, very loosely defined artistic talent, just to modify this sprite in Paint. Oh, this is looking great. I think we're nearly there. What do we think? One more circle, just for look. Great. So this now is artfully modified. We can save straight out of Paint as a ping image, or a JPEG, in fact. And you've got the compression there as well. Slightly simplified export from Paint compared to Change FSI. Here we go. It is now chugging away. It's done it. So if we just get rid of this, we can do one of the things here. Oh, let's do this JPEG. Why not? For completeness, here's how you create a JPEG from Paint. So now we've got a JPEG, we can do what you would hope to be able to do with a JPEG, which is update our backdrop image with our new, very tasteful piece of artwork. So let's see if this works. Drag it over. Let's make it scaled and pop it on the backdrop. Hey, victory. So there we go. That's a fairly trivial example, but hopefully that gives you a flavor of what this new feature or these new features give the user. And it's something I think we've been wanting and hoping for quite a long time. In addition to that, we've got plenty of other progress on bounties. We've got the thing that has been, I think, on many people's wish lists for probably a couple of decades, which is to unify some of the headline features that RISC OS Limited did back in the past in their RISC OS 4 and RISC OS 6 fork with RISC OS 5 and the old Castle RISC OS developments fork. Now that we only have one of those remaining, all of the good features that were in the other fork that's now abandoned, we're looking to bring those across so we can benefit from, in particular here, all of the new enhancements and features in the toolbox once this bounty is complete. And that will be great for developing applications that look slightly better and have slightly more user-friendly functionality. We also have a tool called Git, very friendly name there, which is a very popular development tool for managing source code. And not having support for this natively in RISC OS always complicates the process of developing software on RISC OS that in particular comes from open source projects in the broader community from other operating systems, because more often than not, they'll be stored in Git repositories and you'll have to switch to a different operating system to interact with the source code just to get it onto your machine and then develop your program. Now, if we can get a Git port that works natively on RISC OS, that will enormously simplify the workflow for someone developing. You can track the status of all these things as ever on our bounties part of our website. Very easy to get to. It's in the top bar of the website. So some other things that have been released, these are not really bounty related, they're just other things that have happened. Moredesk, which is something I wrote back in the day. It has been a commercial application up until very recently, and I made the decision to open source it. So now it is available for free for anyone to use, and it is a very powerful virtual desktop manager, amongst other things. We used to include it in what is called NutPy, which is now the Epic distribution, which is a commercial distribution of useful RISC OS tools and applications that RISC OS Open sells. It's no longer on there. What we've done is substitute it for another popular commercial application called CloudFS, which, as you can probably imagine by the name, is a file system that has a cloud backend. So it uses a cloud provider to allow you to natively in RISC OS have a transparent interface onto all the stuff that you're storing on the cloud. So that's a very handy application. It's now in the Epic distribution that RISC OS Open sells. And I wouldn't be surprised at all to see Moredesk make its way into our normal disk image download on the rules site in the near future. Also released recently is this, what's it called? Sample Player. Sorry, I nearly forgot. So Sample Player is like the counterpart to AM Player. So AM Player is a popular MP3 player for RISC OS. Sample Player back in the day was very popular for playing WAVs, AAFs, similar compressed but not lossy audio formats. And it's transferred hands a few times in its history, and it has finally ended up in our hands, and we have taken over maintaining this application. So we've resurrected it a little bit from the dead, and it is now available for free, and it's part of the RISC OS source tree. So anyone who wants to work on it, enhance it, add new features, please feel free. It's open source again. So bounties, looking ahead, we're going to reflect on the fact that it's been a decade now, pretty much next month, since we launched the bounty scheme. And I personally believe it's been enormously successful. It's delivered a lot of valuable new features and applications and fundamental pieces of operating system functionality. All of this has come basically from the community putting their money where their mouth is and sponsoring developers also from the community generally to take on these usually quite significant challenges of adding these important new things. To date, we have completed quite a lot of bounties here. You can see there's 7 major ones completed. There's several in progress right now, and we're accumulating significant amounts of money in the pots of the bounties that we've still got open, including some quite notable donations recently, enormous donations. So thank you very much for everyone who's over the last decade has been showing their support. And I hope you've been reaping the benefits as well and making use of all the new stuff that's been arriving as a result of this. One of the potential criticisms that has been leveled at the bounty scheme, and I think it's unfairly, is the question of what happens when we've all put our money into a bounty pot, but the bounty never goes anywhere. No one claims it, the work never happens, and the bounty expires. In certain crowdfunding sites, typically what happens is once you've reached your target, the project can either succeed or fail, and people will either get the results of that or they'll get nothing and lose their money. I like to think we have a slightly more transparent process here in that it will always be put to good use. So, for example, the 2 bounties that have failed to actually connect the pot of money to a developer and deliver the final goods, both of those, in the end, that feature that was being sought was added to RISC OS anyway. So they still ended up being successful, even though a more roundabout route was required to deliver the features that were requested in the bounty. The other thing to note is the money that was in the bounty pot, if it is expired, we just redistribute it across all of the other open bounties. So if we can't achieve a particular piece of development, we will just spread that across all of the other developments that people are starting to put their money towards to try and spur them on a bit. So it's never wasted. It always ends up, hopefully, in a good place. There is a diagram that I'm going to show you I'm going to float it in front of you and then I'm going to whip it away. There's a lot of detail here, so I don't plan on describing it all now, but I think it's a good narrative of the decade of progress we've had with bounties. It highlights all of the features that have been delivered through the bounty scheme. It shows some of the historic milestones that we've been through in the last decade. There's also a highlight of the bounties that we have open, how close or far we think they are from achieving their target and being kicked off. And it also provides a hint into the roadmap of the future. And we're always looking. I'll talk about this a little bit more in a few minutes, but we're always looking at what next. It's great having the stuff that we're focused on now, but we have to always keep an eye on the future. And this has been described in earlier talks today, is you can't take your eye off the future because the world does not stand still. So in orange, we do have 3 kind of little cloudy thought bubbles there, suggesting some ideas for the future of particular interest. And I will leap over to those soon. But what I will say is one of them is about finishing something that was started a long time ago. So the support for something called Unicode Utf-8, this was added to a lot of the core of RISC OS decades ago. But there's still some rough edges, which mean the experience for trying to use particularly international languages and international fonts is not as smooth as it could be, and you can run into some dead ends at certain points. So this bounty is about polishing those rough edges, eliminating them ideally, and giving us finally the experience that we would like for an international operating system. We're a bit, sometimes it's a little bit too easy to be convinced that English is the only language, and of course it isn't. So let's make sure that this operating system is representative of the global stage that it's operating in. The next bounty that we are going to be opening really soon is the next phase of the filing system development. There's already been 2 phases of this, one of which is still in progress and is making great progress, and that one was addressing partitions. This one is basically about big things, big disks, big files. There's a few other pieces to this which are significant, like maybe moving away from the current on-disk format called ADFS to something a bit more industry standard, perhaps. So what we would like to do is make sure that as the never-ending increase in disk size and file size is, as that marches on, RISC OS doesn't find itself, as it often does, in a world where we can't access all of what's out there because of the inherent limitations in our file system and the operating system around it. So there's a big bounty just kicking off about this, which will be continuing our journey of improving the file system in general. And finally, the third one that we are going to be launching right now is updating the programmers' reference manuals. I have a copy of them over there from 20 odd years ago. They're about that big. There's many pages of documents here. And we're going to have to do this in phases because it's such an enormous project. But the first phase is just about tidying up the programmers' reference manuals into a more coherent set of books. At the moment, you've got a set of volumes, you've got an extra volume with some other bits that reference lots of other bits in the first four, and then you've got additional volumes of errata and addendums. So what we're going to try and do is bring it all back into a sensible sequence of books where it's just describing everything without having to jump back and forth between different volumes all the time. Where some of the volumes are saying, ignore what was in that volume because it's wrong. Here's what you should do. Let's just get it all so it's representative of RISC OS today. And then future phases will start adding more and more of the stuff that's changed in the meantime. So these documents are not only, they're a bit of a snapshot of a moment in history, and they've not been kept in sync with the way the operating system itself and all of the things around it have developed in the last several decades. So lots of work there to do, many man-years of work, in fact, but this one is just the first tranche, the first phase. Looking ahead, this is critical, really, and it's easy to be negative, but I don't think we should. I think we should be positive. There are a lot of opportunities for RISC OS, and there's a lot of things that we could focus on, but we have tried very much to keep adding the things and focusing on the things that are foundational and important in allowing us to keep pace with the rest of the world. The worst that can happen is we lag so far behind that it becomes impossible to move from outside of RISC OS into RISC OS. And in our position that I think we've earned over the time since RISC OS Open started back in 2006, we feel that as the hub of the community where people come and meet and share ideas, we also feel in a privileged position to be able to see what everyone is talking about, what all the ideas are, and coordinate them a little bit and help bring the right people together. So, for example, we work quite closely now with RISC OS developments. We have regular meetings with them. And we also work with a lot of the key developers in the community to try and bring a sense of a plan, a sense of a grand scheme, and perhaps a prioritized backlog of things that we could do that we're all aligned on. So we're not competing with each other on this. We're not going in different divergent directions again, like has happened in the past. We feel a responsibility to try and bring some coordination to the process. We're working in 6 particular areas within RISC OS Open. We've got our eyes on 6 particular things, and I'll talk briefly about them today, but over the coming year or so, I think you'll be finding out a lot more about where our thoughts are pointed and how we think we can start addressing these 6 headline topics. One of them is about just supporting more RAM, so more memory in devices. Some models we can gain access in a limited way to large amounts of memory, but RISC OS basically has some hard limits, and we want to try and raise those limits significantly, as most people's desktop PCs now will have more than 4 gigabytes of RAM in them. Most people's laptops even will have more than 4 gigabytes of RAM in them. So RISC OS's limitations, although it's very lean and you quite often don't need lots of memory for RISC OS type activities, applications, the more you start thinking, well, on more powerful hardware, we might be able to do video manipulation and I've got this HD camera over here generating enormous files, then it becomes relevant again. So that's one topic that we're looking at. How do we solve it? What's the easiest way and the way that gives us the best bang for our buck? We're also looking at BBC Basic, the language. We're looking at how to modernize it a little bit. So a bit of a revamp there. In particular, structures and dynamic memory allocation. Blah, blah. I can almost not spit that one out. We want to bring some modern language features to BASIC without moving away from what feels like the core of what BASIC is, its essence. We're talking to various people, and we want this to be a coordinated effort so that the language that we arrive at is sound and future-proof and a good basis for other further developments to the language in the future. And this has been mentioned many times in previous talks, but there was recently an announcement by ARM that in the ARM version 9 architecture, the 32-bit ARM architecture that we're all very connected to in the RISC OS world, is going to become very, very hard to access, if impossible. So I'm trying to think of a very simple way to describe it, but for the most part, it's easy to think that most processors that are ARM version 9 won't even support the 32-bit architecture. And even if they do, it won't be to a level that RISC OS could run on. So to make sure that we have a future to run this operating system on hardware that will come out in future years and make the benefits for all the other improvements that come with that hardware, there's some fairly hard problems to solve. And this is where the coordination between RISC OS Open, within RISC OS developments, and other key developers in the community, this is where we have to be talking together and coming up with a combined plan, because the amount of engineering that has to happen to support this stuff is significant, and it quite often will come at a cost. So how that cost is realized is a bigger discussion than just RISC OS Open, bigger discussion than probably our bounty scheme. The fourth thing to discuss is multi-core support, which has been making actual progress. So this is great to see. We've made a couple of announcements recently about this. So if you follow us on Twitter, you'll have seen some of our tweets. But this is creeping along in the background. Jeffrey Lee is being a bit of a star here, and he's been making good progress on this one. Multi-monitor support is something we would like to see, because we already have several platforms, several pieces of RISC OS hardware that can, in theory, do multiple displays. But RISC OS itself doesn't natively support this. And now, there was a tool called Geminus in the past, which allowed you to do this on certain hardware. But what we believe is the right answer is to make the operating system, and in particular the desktop, understand how to do this natively, so you don't end up in a world where error boxes appear halfway between two monitors, for example. And finally, there's another piece of work which is actually underway, which is called vector floating point. It's quite technical, but what it basically means is a lot of difficult math stuff can be accelerated significantly by taking advantage of a lot of the features in modern ARM cores. And at the moment, we don't take advantage of those features. And especially in the tools, the build tools that we sell, if you compile your program into the thing that you can then give to people that runs on their machines, it's not taking advantage of all these whizzy maths features in modern processors. So there's work to be done and actually underway, focusing on this. But generally speaking, that means some hard mathsy stuff like crunching videos or doing difficult calculations. That could all potentially be speeded up significantly by this improvement. So that is the end of the scripted content, if you'll call it that. I'll just open the floor now to any questions.
Steve, thank you very much. This and together with the presentation from Rod was absolutely amazing today. Vectors.
Yep.
Have you guys already started to lay down some code? Because I actually started to work on something like that for the AI part, to exploit basically Neon to have a math library. I started with GCC, but the goal is to actually make the library available to DDE. So transform it back into an AIF library. So maybe I may have, I don't know, something. I know you guys are much better at this thing, so, but.
I tell you, it sounds like we should definitely talk about this offline and make sure that if you can help us with what we're doing, that would be fantastic. Yes, we have started writing code. We've started adding features to the build tool code in the background as well. Rob Sproson's been keeping an eye on this one quite closely. So I don't know if he could chip in, but we could certainly get in touch. If you got in touch with us outside of this, we will hook you up and start planning how you can help us and work on this.
I've been writing lots of test harnesses and ways of checking that the code is calculating the correct value. That's generally the hardest part. It's, the adding, subtracting, dividing, and multiplying isn't overly difficult. It's knowing that you're doing it to a precision that allows you to carry those calculations forward. If you do 3 multiplies in succession, you need to make sure that you're not rounding off the values at each stage and losing some bits. So yeah, it's interesting maths under the bonnet there.
Yeah. Actually, Genon could be a potential very good test environment for that, because basically it uses an impressive amount of floating point, especially when you do the back-forwarding neuronal network, because the back-forwarding try to train back the neuronal network after the forwarding has happened. So it kind of like move back and forth, right? That's what's called back-forwarding. And so their calculation goes exponentially crazy, which is why I started to work on this as well, like because performance were not particularly good.
Yeah,
sure.
Yeah, we'll definitely have more conversations offline. I think we might set up some Zoom calls. That would be great. I just saw a question in the chat about the status of the file system part 2 bounty. You're correct in an observation that this one hasn't really moved very quickly since kind of a spurt of progress about a year or so ago. What's happened there is the person who's claimed this bounty has found themselves engaged in a significant piece of contract work for a client. So they've put it on the back burner for a bit, and we know they're going to do a great job. So we're not pushing them to finish the job right now. We'll let them pick the time that suits them so that they can close that bounty off. But we can see the benefit of opening the next phase early, because there's some other bits and pieces that we can get cracking on in the meantime. So we're happy to have both of those open in parallel, but it's also worth saying that the second one still needs to accumulate enough money in the first place to start progressing. So we're in a way, we're getting ahead of the game on that one.
It's probably also worth saying that the part 2 of the filing system bounty was originally scoped out as just bolting on partitions underneath. That proved to be impractical from a technical point of view, and rewriting it in C turned out to be the more prudent, but the more direct solution. And that, of course, helps you in the future, because once it's written in C, you can recompile it and take any advantages that you get from a C compiler change, rather than having to go and rummage around in 50,000 lines of assembler.
I've got a question about Compute Module 4. The eMMC on board the Compute Module 4 doesn't seem to work under RISC OS at the moment, and the light versions seem to only start up correctly once in 4 times with the mouse freezing. Do you have any comments about that, please?
Not really aware of what that one is, so it sounds like a bug report to raise so we can put it in the bug tracker. But yes, sorry, I'm afraid that's the first I've heard of that one, but yes, I'm sure we can look into it.
I can explain a little bit more. The eMMC on the Compute Module 4 uses an 8-bit data bus and uses eMMC2, so I suspect it's not provided for yet.
Yeah, the Compute Module 4 came out about 2 days after RISC OS 5.28. Unfortunately, unusually, no samples were made available beforehand. So previously, some contacts within the Raspberry Pi Foundation, you can usually get your hands on some of the prototypes a bit early, so you get some visibility, but that wasn't the case with the Compute Module 4. So it was done slightly by guesswork, wondering what it might look like, and I guess the guess wasn't very good, or the guess wasn't quite right, so there's definitely some more engineering required to sort that out.
Yeah, but we do have an area on our forum for bug reports. So by all means, start a topic there and we'll be able to transcribe that into something in our bug tracker.
Steve?
Yes?
I've got a question about Git. You mentioned it. I've downloaded something called Git by someone called Abicat. I don't know who he is. Is that related to your Git effort?
So there have been a couple of efforts at porting Git clients that have gone to various lengths. They're not as complete or integrated as we would like them to be. So I don't think this is anything to do with the one that we've done in our bounty. We're looking at a slightly different approach that's a bit more native. With
the GUI, presumably?
Ideally. Ultimately.
I mean, the Git I've got downloaded is command line only, but I haven't really used it much. I don't know if it works even, but
yeah.
Okay.
They're very divisive having a user interface on Git. Some people swear by it, other people swear about it. I think so. We'll get the fundamentals working, the command line side.
I know that Linus Torvald said he hated GUIs and he invented Git. So I guess it's par for the course not to have a GUI.
Yeah, I think we have a role to keep an eye on both sides of the arguments.
Okay.
The PNG work that you did, that you were demonstrating in Paint and Change FSI, does that also mean that we can now save screenshots from Paint with in those formats so that we can email them in sort of?
Yes. Yeah. So the screenshot tool will still just open in a new Paint window, and then you can save it whichever format suits.
Okay.
Steve, going back to your bounties that are there, the USB Stage 2 update seems to have been stuck there for a while now, even though it's exceeded the bounty. Do you know a reason why that may have not attracted anyone?
I think there's just quite a lot of other projects going on for all the main developers in and around the community right now. There's some exciting stuff going on, like web browsers and some of the other bounties that we've got open. I think it just speaks to the fact that we don't have all that many developers available who can claim all of these things simultaneously. So it's a shame, but it will. We take a view. We don't expire bounties on a particular timescale. We don't say we'll leave it open for 3 months and then expire it. We give it a reasonable run where we think if it's just that the time isn't right, then that's why we don't think it's been claimed, or maybe we think we need to rethink the target and set the target higher, then we'll extend its life and we'll leave it open for quite a long time. As you've seen, we've only actually expired 2 bounties in the decade, I think. So typically it'll stay open and it will eventually happen. It's just we're not yet in the lucky position that some of the other operating systems are, where we have many developers available to potentially claim these things.
Yeah, I guess it comes back to some of the work that Rod are doing, trying to get new people in there, probably Cloverleaf, and some of the work that yourselves have done to try and get new blood into the community that may be able to help on.
I believe it is working. I'm seeing plenty of new faces on forums, people asking relevant and useful questions, people getting involved and even claiming some of our bounties. So I feel like the reach and the exposure is increasing rather than decreasing. So that's a great thing for RISC OS. Long may that continue. But we're always walking a bit of a tightrope to make sure that we are getting the important things done so that we're not being left behind, so that people are being attracted in. And I've talked in the past about virtuous circles. These virtuous circles need to keep being fed.
Steve, I've got a question about the ping support.
Yes.
Is it packaged so that someone else could use it easily? I'm thinking of
the library underpinning it, yes.
I'm thinking of artworks. Now, obviously, Martin's doesn't do much these days and he's very busy, but having ping output in artworks would be wonderful.
There's a underlying module called compressed PNG, which has a very, very similar interface that you can call from BASIC or C or whatever. It's very similar to the compressed JPEG module that we've had since RISC OS 3.6, I think. So there's a start SWI, then you write the rasters, and then there's a finish SWI, and the result is a PNG file.
Okay,
It almost sounds like the sort of thing Martin might be able to squeeze into an evening of development. Maybe ask him the question.
Does that include 8-bit masking? The alpha channel support. So if you feed in raster with 8-bit in 8-bit mask format, do we get PNG with?
Yes, so you can have either masks or alpha blending. That I think is what you mean.
That's supported by the module, is it?
Yeah.
Oh, fantastic! Nice work.
That's something for your browser as well, Andrew. Fantastic. Any other questions?
Steve, there was one that whizzed past on the chat while you were talking a moment ago. That was on that infographic, the thought bubbles on the right-hand side. Just to talk a bit more about whether those are aspirational or all in progress, or how are they selected, or that sort of thing. That was from Nitrex, someone from Nitrex. But you've muted yourself.
I'll just sit here and talk to myself in silence. I'll switch back to that graphic. Here we go. Are we seeing this?
That's the one, yes.
Great. Okay, so
on the right.
The stuff on the right is a combination of things from the rule wish list that the community has been feeding into. We also have a roadmap area in our wiki where we try and capture and collate the high-level stuff that we could see needed for RISC OS as it goes forward. You could think of it as the idea car park. So it is the list of ideas of the big picture things that RISC OS would really benefit from. And if someone were to come along and say, here's £5 million, we'd probably get most of this stuff done. And RISC OS would be a much richer operating system as a result. But with the way the community works at the moment, we have to be a bit more strategic about it. So this is the sort of thing that we would present when we're having conversations with RISC OS developments, when we're talking to developers. We're seeing where there are sweet spots, where there's perhaps some ability out there to make something happen, and there's an alignment of belief from the different people involved that it's a worthwhile activity. And that's when we start pulling things forward. Some of the things that RISC OS Open can independently pull forward into our bounty scheme. But as I say, some of the things are just too big and too complicated, just too hairy. So that's where we have to have the bigger conversations with other people in the community to say, how are we going to unstick these? How are we going to make these things happen? And I think, as Andrew Rawnsley has said earlier today, sometimes you have to think outside the box a little bit and choose something that's maybe a bit more radical. And it's not necessarily the traditional solution we would come up with for RISC OS, but it's a stepping stone to getting these things into RISC OS. We've seen examples of this in the past. We've seen ports of Firefox just so that we could get some modern browsing. It came with all kinds of compromises and issues, but at least for a period that solved a problem, a real problem. We have to try and find good, solid, future-proof solutions for these things. But it quite often will take a lot of coordination. And so don't expect all this stuff to happen quickly unless we suddenly have an enormous windfall and can hire lots of developers and give them a job developing RISC OS for the next several years. Okay, we will put this on our website and we can have a bit of commentary, a bit of discussion on the forum about it as well.
Steve, what's the plans on USB 3 development?
I believe that's in one of our bounties. Hold on a sec. Are you able? Yeah, thank you. Rob, is it in the? Let me just check. Is it in the open bounty right now?
Yeah, so it gets a passing mention, and this is perhaps a reflection of how the bounty text has dated since it was first opened, because at the time that the bounty was spec'd, USB 3 support in NetBSD, which is where the USB stack originates, was very, how should I say it politely, so very infant in its infancy, and so in the 3 or 4 years while it's been open, that's definitely moved on a bit, and it may be that can be that's sufficiently stable now that it would be of use to RISC OS. But yeah, at the time the bounty text was written, it's just penciled in lightly as a may be able to support USB 3 on the understanding that it wasn't actually finished in NetBSD at that point.
Right. Any other questions?
Yeah, another one. So half monopolised. Just a bit of a can of worms. In the future, do you see RISC OS going down the sort of Linux distro style route? I mean, or will there just be one? I mean, there's several distros now, basically, that aren't very different. I just wondered if you saw your job as ruled as providing a kernel and other people putting distros together. Say, for example, the new pin board, for example, would that be something in a distro, or would you see that as coming out in the base product?
I think the future you're describing is already now. It's already here. So RISC OS Open, we host the source tree, and we happen to build builds each night. So we build new releases off the latest source tree. We host these on our website, but they're essentially our distro of RISC OS. Now that it's open source under the Apache license, anyone else can host it. Anyone else can host their distro, build their distro. And for example, RISC OS developments have their RISC OS Direct distribution. Yeah. And that is essentially derived from what we're hosting with some extra special sauce that they've added. And it's just eminently possible now for anyone else to create their distro. Maybe they cut it down for some particular purpose, or they add extra pieces for a particular vertical market. So we don't see that as a problem. We see that as just part of the making the whole ecosystem of RISC OS richer. But we still see our place in the middle of it as the hosts of the source code and some amount of trying to coordinate collaboration of how it moves forwards, how it develops the core of RISC OS. Anyone else could fork it and develop it in their own particular way. There's nothing we can do to stop that. There's nothing RISC OS developments can do to stop that. It's part of the terms of the Apache license. But it's in the best interests, I think, of the community that we do try and have a single point of truth for what RISC OS is, because there's so little strength in depth of developers out there that you don't want to dilute it too much.
I'm really wondering about how people who do produce good stuff outside of rule get you to adopt what they've done without causing bad feeling, as it has been with the audio stuff.
Could you unpick that one a little bit?
Well, if people say, for example, Andrew today demonstrated the pin board. Now, I know that Rod are talking to rules, so that's not a problem. He has a route to get stuff in. But if you're developing stuff and you're not part of Rod and not part of rule, and you would like it adopted because it's good enough and should be in the core, how does one go about it?
Well, just get in touch and ask if you want to, how you can put it into our sources and into our nightly builds. One of the things that we do have is we're hosting a source tree, a GitLab server, where all the sources are. You can create your own private projects in GitLab, or even public projects in GitLab that are essentially forks of RISC OS. So you can create your stuff in there, hosted on the same server, and increasingly we could make it very easy to adopt those things into the core, rather than being sat out on the fringe as your experiments or your own personal fork. You can bring it in to being part of the normal RISC OS nightly fork. It makes it, if we host those projects on our server, it makes it even more convenient to make that transition.
Okay, that looks like the way forward to me then. It's to use your Git source. Yeah,
the GitLab server, yes. Okay. But that it doesn't have to work that way, of course. You could host your sources wherever you want, but it's convenient to start in that place and in our structure. Then it makes the migration of bringing it into the heart of our builds much more straightforward for various reasons.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, I'd just like to say thank you for the sampler thing. What's a music player extension thing? That's one I used to use a lot on RISC OS 4 and 6, so that'd be very useful. I just noticed Andrew Ronsley said that he'll be feeding back the pin board to yourselves to go into presumably nightly builds before an even point increase. That's how it works, isn't it? Normally odds are nightly builds taking up your own risk to some extent, but generally fairly stable.
I believe so. I believe it works well. One of the things that I do know, I think there may be some incompatibility between some of the extensions made there and Moredesk. So I think I've got an open ticket on myself to fix Moredesk.
That's a concern of mine, Steve. I couldn't. I've had to stop using Pinboard because of caches with Moredesk, and I can't do without Moredesk. So if you can fix that up, yeah, that'd be very good. I can report them to you if you like.
Yeah, I will try and I promise to try and find time this year to actually do some work on Moredesk.
Would that be including putting the code into RISC OS, Steve?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think I talked about hosting your code on our GitLab server. I think one of the things I've done in violation of my own open source license for Moredesk is I've not yet published the sources. It's one of those, I'll get around to it. So my thought is I will just host it in the RISC OS source tree, the way other third-party software is. And then that way it'll make it very easy for us to just put it in our nightly builds. So if you want Moredesk, when you download the latest disk image, you'll get Moredesk in it. There's no reason not to now that it's open source. So that's certainly my plan. And once it's there, it'll be quite a lot more straightforward for me then to fix any issues like pinboard incompatibilities.
Well, I've got a helper to Moredesk called Rotor, which I've stopped using because I had some zero-page problems with it. But I'll promise I'll get back to that as well now that Moredesk is becoming more in the open.
Yeah. Also, don't forget to check out Cloud FS, which is now taking its place. is something that's often overlooked on RISC OS machines is, have you got good backups? Are your files safe if your hard drive blows up, or increasingly your SD card in your Raspberry Pi? What happens when it stops working? Where's all your files? So it's well worth having a look at that.
I got an offer today from CloudFS for a lifetime's membership and 500 gig for £110. Is that good value?
Sounds reasonable.
Pounds per year sounds quite good.
It's for a lifetime, one-off payment for my life's not that long now, but if I were a young man, I would go for it.
Take an optimistic view. Assume another 50 years.
Yeah, I think we should be coming towards the end of questions now. We've just got 4 minutes before sign domain start at 3.
Well, thank you, everyone.
Question, please. Can I ask one question?
Yeah, go on.
Great.
Are there any plans to get around the life font licensing problem on the user guide so it can be free? And will the PRMs have the same problem?
So the problem is essentially that the fonts that we are using, we bought a license which only RISC OS Open can publish these documents because they're the fonts that they used historically. Changing the documents to use a different font is an enormous pile of negative work. It would take a vast amount of effort to arrive at something that looks the same. So the right answer is to buy a more permissive license for those fonts. But right now, whoever wants to distribute these documents without coming into that licensing problem, I think it's down to them to front up the money to pay for the better license, because RISC OS Open don't see why we would want to pay an additional several £100 for a more permissive license when we've already bought the license ourselves. So I think if there's a general desire to host some of these documents, these books in digital form, for example, then certainly get in touch with Rule and we can let you know what the licensing details are and what it would take to bump it up to a more permissive level so that other people can publish them.
Could a bounty be?
That's like a bounty, yeah.
On that?
It could even be a bounty, yeah.
Do you know what the figure is?
I don't know. It depends on. Well, I know for more permissive, it would be about £400, I think. Last time we looked, but I don't know how many other rights holders that extends it to. Whether that's just generally, it could be published in digital form by anyone. I'd have to go back and look into it. But it was certainly of the order of several £100. So well within the reach of a bounty, for example.
There were quite a few questions about PRMs and cost and things in the comments. So everyone should get in contact with yourselves. There's 2 different ways of doing that, I think.
Absolutely. So thank you for all the great questions. It's been a good afternoon.
Yeah, thanks very much. Always useful to see that things are ongoing. So yeah, good. Looking forward to the future of the RISC OS. Thank you.